Hello, my friends, and welcome to another Painting the Wilderness challenge. This time we are painting tiny national parks, and that's because I just released my newest book, National Parks in Watercolor, and I thought what better way to celebrate than painting a whole bunch of teeny tiny national park paintings. So the whole idea behind this challenge is you don't need to go overboard on the details in order to create a truly magical experience and memory for yourself. And especially when you're painting such iconic scenes, it's so important to let loose and be in the moment. And what better way to let go of all of the details than by painting small? For our first tiny park, we are painting Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is probably one of the most iconic mountain peaks in the United States, if not the world. And so I thought it would be such a fun way to kick off the challenge. One thing to remember when you're painting mountains especially is there are so many tiny shadows and crags that might seem imperative in order to make the mountain look realistic, but I promise nature is wild and your painting is allowed to be too. It's okay if the shadows are just scribbles. It's okay if what you're focusing on are broad shapes and general contrast as opposed to getting every single tiny detail right. And it's also okay to make a giant mess and still have fun anyway. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, first things first is we're going to open up our sketchbook. This sketchbook is 100% cotton watercolor paper. It's linked in the description below, and we're going to use tape to make a space for our tiny landscape. Now, you can also cut your paper into a tiny landscape size if you would prefer that. I think it's really fun to use tape and then just have a lot of paper on the outside to keep it in a sketchbook, so that's what I'm doing here. And then I'm just going to make a very light sketch to give myself some reference for where to put the mountain, where to put the lake, where to put the trees. And I really only need 2 lines for this. One line for the mountain, I'm not trying to go for perfection here. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And then 1 line for the lake, where the landscape is going to meet the lake. And the mountain is going to be about in the center, with the lake portion having about 1/3 of the scene along the bottom. Then I'm going to take a round size number 6 brush, get the sky wet, only the sky. So I'm painting around the edges of the mountain, and I'm using a turquoise color. This is like an aqua from Winsor Newton, and I'm painting with the turquoise color first, starting at the top and then kind of loosely painting toward the bottom. Then I added some indigo at the top, always making sure that there's a little area right above the mountain edge that is light. So the way to keep that space light and the top of the sky dark is to start painting at the top of the sky pretty much always when there's paint on your brush, then wash off your brush and use a clean brush only with water to paint along the edge of the mountain so that the water can push the paint away from the edge of the mountain. So you get that nice glow along the mountain edge and then the dark sky along the top of the sky. Next, I'm going to wet the lake. So I'm still going to use that turquoise color. To make turquoise, you can just mix green and blue. Also, you don't have to use the exact colors that I'm using, though the colors I am using are linked in the description below. I'm going to make the lake a little bit more green than the sky. So I'm starting with some green, some like dark green, so you can mix indigo with a green color, or this is Cascade Green by Daniel Smith, and I'm painting along the bottom edge just a little bit. But then I'm also trying to paint, I'm looking at the picture, I'm also trying to paint a reflection of the mountain, a very loose reflection of the mountain. The most important thing here is that there's that little bit of white space that is kind of like in the shape of the top of the mountain where there's going to be snow. So you see how like along the bottom I have the green, and then there's a little bit of white space, and then there's the green and the blue from the mountain. Now we're using the wet on wet technique here, which makes it tricky. While it's still wet, you can use what's called a thirsty brush, which is a clean brush that you blot on a towel so it doesn't have much water on it, and then use that to press along the wet wash to lift some of the paint. You can do that to create like horizontal marks for the lake, or you can do that to, again, create the white space around the mountain reflection. So we want the reflection to be like kind of a darker blue, and then the green of the lake along the bottom. Let it dry, and now we're going to paint the mountain. We're going to come back to the lake. So I'm using a very, very light value, meaning watery indigo. So for the mountain, I'm going to paint most of the mountain that very, very light, watery indigo, but leave just the tops of the mountain with white space so that it looks like there's snow. And then I'm going to tap in just a little bit of indigo, like still pretty light value, along where the wet wash was. So we have this, we've carved out a little bit of white space, and then the rest of the mountain is kind of this like very light gray. Let it dry, or dry it with a dryer, and then use a round number 2 brush, this is like a detail brush, with indigo or Payne's gray or some kind of shadowy color like that, and then just paint some wet on dry scribbles, basically. This mountain is in the distance. We do not need it to be perfect. We do not need it to look exactly right. We just need to imply that there are crags and shadows along the mountain, especially because this is a tiny landscape, right? We are majorly simplifying here. So both with the mountain and with the trees and with the lake, we're not going for this is exactly right. What we're going for is this is the general shape of what we're trying to paint. And by simplifying it, we're not only making it more doable and accessible for us as painters, but we're also making it more easy to read and translate on a tiny piece of paper. So you're being a more like quality artist by simplifying, because you can't really add too much detail on teeny tiny pieces of paper. Next, the trees. The mountain is dry, so I drew a line. I painted a line to do like the tree line along the base of the lake. And then to paint the trees, I'm just painting a bunch of vertical lines all across in that space so that it's just along the bottom of the mountain and I can still see the lake. And that's all there is, just a bunch of teeny vertical lines. It's okay if there's white space between the vertical lines. In fact, we want that because there might be snow in that grove of trees, right? Then I'm going to take my brush that is still kind of wet and just paint it along the bottom of the tree line to kind of blend in the tree line with the lake. Then I wanted to darken up the bottom of the lake a little bit, so I took some indigo with my round number 2 brush, and I painted just along the bottom of the lake and then used a clean brush to kind of blend it into itself. This works really well when the indigo is pretty watery, and then you rinse off your brush and just kind of using a clean brush, kind of feather the edge into the white space. So we're not trying to make the white space blue, we're just trying to kind of make it disappear. And it's okay if there are some dried paint lines, it's okay if it doesn't blend in fully, because any dried paint lines are just going to look like ripples in the water. It's any kind of imperfection here, especially because we're painting a landscape, it's just going to add texture. So the next thing that we're going to do with some white gouache, and I'm using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White here, is to paint some very, very subtle ripples in the water. So some very thin lines, horizontal lines across the lake, and then splatter on some stars in the sky. So the ripples in the water are going to make it look more like water. That's one of my favorite tricks with white gouache, is to paint teeny tiny little horizontal ripples in water to make it look more like water. And then the stars, we're going to go through at least a few times to try to make the stars look really plentiful in the sky. And that's it. That's all we got. The most important thing here in trying to make this teeny tiny landscape painting look really magical, look really ethereal, is to maintain the white space. So when you're watching this and then you go to paint it for yourself, right, we're painting a teeny tiny Mount Rainier, and in order to make it look like it's glowing off of the page, we want to make sure to have that line of white space in the lake, the reflection of the mountain, and to make sure to maintain the white space just above the mountain and on the mountain. The contrast of the dark at the top of the sky and the bottom of the lake with the trees all the way across with the white mountain, that contrast is what's going to make it look so magical. So, when you're painting it yourself, even if a bunch of these other details feel like really tricky to grasp, remember you don't need to capture all of those. It's most important to pick one or two details that are that feel doable for you to focus on and that are going to make a big difference. And here I in my opinion, it's the contrast between the white space and then the dark spaces. So even if all of the none of the other little details translate, that trying to maintain the white spaces and then the really dark spaces, that's going to help you capture this really beautiful scene. So now next is one of my very, very favorite parts of these challenges. What did I love and what did I learn? Personally, like I said, I really loved the contrast between the light spaces and the dark spaces. I also think the contrast worked really well because it's not just light and dark, it's also like because we had that little bit of white space above the mountain that was in the sky using the wet on wet technique, it's really blurry. And so the blurry of the white space with the really sharp defined dark space with the trees especially, I think those 2 points of contrast make this scene really pop. I also really liked the color combination. I really liked the blue and the turquoise. I think that they worked really well together. What did I learn? Well, sometimes keeping the contrast at the top and at the bottom in the middle, that's going to kind of help solidify the composition. I also learned that it's okay to not know what you're doing. It's okay to make things simple. You can still make it beautiful. So that's it. Thanks so much for painting with me, my friends.